All right, let's continue with attachment. And I'm going to start. This second half is going to be better than the first half. The second half was what I added on yesterday. And I was much more aware of creating something more exciting. So you're going to watch a few videos on attachment right now. This is going to provide an explanation of attachment theory and why attachment theory is so important. Now, again, this is a theory developed on white Western, white middle-class children like me. We're going to watch another video that looks at those differences. But this is a very important concept because attachment really does influence development in the long term. So, and I will stop a few times to kind of highlight my own experience.
The attachment theory argues that a strong emotional and physical bond to one primary caregiver in our first years of life is critical to our development. If our bonding is strong and we are securely attached, then we feel safe to explore the world. We know that there is always that safe base which we can return to any time. If our bond is weak, we feel insecurely attached. We are afraid to leave or explore a rather scary-looking world because we are not sure if we can return. People who are securely attached are said to have greater trust, can connect to others, and as a result are more successful in life. Insecurely attached people tend to mistrust others, lack social skills, and have problems forming relationships. There is one type of secure attachment, and there are three types of insecure attachments: anxious ambivalent, anxious avoidant, and anxious disorganized. In responses to distress, the first three react organized, while the last acts disorganized. To understand the theory better, let's look at Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who have 4 children: Luca, Anne, Joe, and Amy. The Smiths are lovely parents who cuddle, make frequent eye contact, speak warmly, and are always there for their kids. But one day, Mr. Smith falls very sick and dies. For Mrs. Smith, life now becomes very difficult. She spends all day working, while at the same time trying to care for her children. An impossible task. At 6 years of age, Luca's brain is for the most part developed, his character strong and his worldview shaped. The new situation does not affect him much. He knows there is still always Mum, his safe haven. He feels securely attached. Later, he turns into a trusting and optimistic young man. His self-image is positive. Anne, who is 3, has problems coping with the new lack of attention. To Anne, her mother now acts.
I'm gonna take a minute though. This is the second time I've watched this video, and I can honestly say I'm not certain that would be true for the oldest because we're not taking into consideration the potential that the mom might rely on that child to be a support in the absence of the father. Because that does happen, and we do, parents will lean on older children if they are struggling themselves.
Unpredictably. She is anxious about their relationship and as a result becomes clingy. To get her mum's attention, she has to raise her emotional state and scream. When her mum finally reacts with a predictable response, she herself acts ambivalent and doesn't show her true feelings. Later in life, others think Anne is unpredictable or moody. Her self-image is less positive. Her attachment style is anxious ambivalent. 2-year-old Joe spends his days with his uncle, who loves him, but thinks that a good education means being strict. If little Joe shows too much emotion or is too loud, his uncle gets angry and sometimes punitive. This scares Joe. He learns that to avoid fear, he has to avoid showing his feelings, also in other situations. As an adult, he continues this strategy and has problems entering relationships. His image of himself is rather negative. His attachment is anxious avoidant.
and that is my brother's attachment. He would not say it, but that is him. Does not feel comfortable around emotion.
Amy, who is just 1 year old, gets sent to a nursery. The staff there is poorly trained, overworked, and often very stressed. Some are outright abusive. Amy therefore becomes anxious of the very people she seeks security from, a conflict which totally disorganizes her ideas about love and safety. As she is experiencing fear without resolution, she tries to avoid all social situations. As an adult, she thinks of herself as unworthy of love. Her self-image is very negative. Her attachment is anxious, disorganized.
And that is my attachment style.
Our attachment is formed in the very first years of our lives, a time when we are too young to communicate our anxiety and as a result can experience high levels of stress. Then our adrenal gland, an organ sitting on top of our kidneys, produces the stress hormones adrenaline and cortisol. The heart rate increases, the blood pressure goes up, and we become alert. If that happens frequently, it is called toxic stress. Toxic because it impairs the development of a child's brain and weakens the immune system. In embryos or at a very young age, toxic stress can even switch the expressions of genes, which can affect our health many decades later.
And this is when we're talking about the interaction between environment and genetics. This is some of what we're talking about. Addiction is one of those kind of light switches where if we have the predisposition, because someone else in our family was an addict, and then we have this toxic stress, that light switch might be turned on for us. There's more to it, but that's one of the examples.
By simulating a strange situation, we can assess an attachment style already by the age of 1. To do this, we let the child play with their mother for a few minutes inside a room. Then the child is left alone. The key moment is the child's reaction when her mother returns. Securely attached children first usually hug their mother, then can calm down and eventually get back to playing. Insecurely attached children can be ambivalent and avoidant. Some can't stop crying or refuse to continue playing.
Again, I told you I'd stop throughout this video. Something else to think about, and this was heartbreaking when I learned about it. In 2016, when Trump was elected, and this is regardless of your politics, when there was the policy of separating children from their parents. What was very difficult for people like me who have worked in early childhood was knowing that by doing so, we were very negatively impacting their attachment. And what you see is what might have been a secure attachment when removed. When these children are brought to their parents again, their parents are just overwhelmed with emotion. Many of these children are ambivalent or don't know how to react. And that is because they have endured a trauma during those critical years of life that negatively affected their attachment. And it's sad that these parents may or may not, it depends, I don't know, but there could have been some really great parents there that were trying to do the right thing, and in doing so, lost this connection they had with their children. And the people who suffered the most will be their children because of these lifelong issues.
The long-term effects of our attachment in the early years are well documented. Using the theory, researchers at Minnesota University were able to predict already at age 3 if a child would drop out of high school with 77% accuracy. In another study, undergraduates at Harvard were asked to assess how close they felt to their parents. 35 years later, they were asked about their health. 91% of those who said they had a rather broken relationship with their mother were also diagnosed with health issues, including coronary artery disease, hypertension, and alcoholism. For those that had reported a warm relationship, the figure of poor health diagnosis was just 45%. But there is another reason why the early years deserve special attention. They are the starting place for subsequent behaviors. A kid that feels securely attached at age 2 can make friends at kindergarten. Their worldview gets reinforced with every interaction, and they develop optimism. As a result, they make good relationships at school, then at college, and later at work. Highly insecurely attached children can miss out on this opportunity. Psychologist John Bowlby, a pioneer in attachment theory, allegedly said, "What cannot be communicated to the mother cannot be communicated to the self." In other words, those who feel insecurely attached might not quite understand themselves. To get to know who they are and what they feel, they might have to go way back in time.
So, I'm going to pause just for a second so I can blow. All right. So, moving on. Why is it important? Attachment has been found to have the greatest influence on development. Guess what? And I can attest to that. I am anxious, disorganized. It has impacted all of my relationships. I am divorced, and not because I found an abusive partner, more because I didn't know who I was. I was made to people please because I didn't feel like I was worthy of love, so I had to make myself worthy. And I wish that were not true of a lot of other people, but it is. For me, and you never know how this can happen, similar to one of those children, although I had one distant parent, I did have one nurturing and loving parent. But something my mom was forced to do when I was 6 weeks old that I know she wishes she didn't have to was send me to home daycare. And similar to the situation of the youngest child, it was not a healthy environment. I was safe, but safety was probably the only thing that could be guaranteed. I can't say my babysitter was emotionally attentive. When her daughters were home, they were bullies to me. There were times when she just said, "You can't come in here," so she could watch her soap opera. But that's because, I feel for my mom because she regrets that time. I know that that's all she could do. But that, with the fact that my father was a very unpredictable person who didn't really like children, led to my anxious, disorganized attachment. My brother had a similar experience, yet it led him to be anxious, ambivalent. But both of us have had clear issues. My brother cannot show emotion. He is not comfortable with emotion. It's very interesting. I am extremely emotive, but I am disorganized. So I can attest to this personally because I know when we were younger, we didn't have our parents weren't there all the time. We were sent to a home daycare that was not high quality from a very, very young age. At that time, that was the only option my mom had. She had to work full time. I know part of it was because my dad led her to believe that was what she needed to do in addition to caring for the kids when she was home. So my mom was also highly stressed when she was home. So I know from my own personal experience, this is important. I know from my family, this is important. But I want to be very careful that this is not true for all cultures. I am definitely someone who is true to white middle class. That's how I grew up. So it makes sense that this theory developed with white middle class children was very true to me. Some of it, a lot of this is still true for children from different cultures, but it can look different. Let's watch this video about variations in attachment Um, and then I have an activity to go along.
How should we parent our children? Turns out you'll get a very different answer depending on which part of the world you ask that question. From some cultures, encouraging the mother to always have the baby close to her wherever she goes, including sleep time, whereas for others, moving the baby to sleep in their own room by 6 months is seen as the norm. So how might cultural differences like these impact attachments? Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. Previously, we have considered Ainsworth's strange situation as a method of assessing the quality of attachment between a child and their caregiver. This was where she identified the attachment types of secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant. And from this, researchers began to ask how these attachment types might vary around.
So let me stop. My attachment theory is actually based on Bowlby. These are still very similar. Secure attachment for Bowlby is the same for Ainsworth. Insecure attachments are very similar to the anxious attachment forms that Bowlby describes.
The world. So in this video, we're going to explore cultural variations in attachment. Culture refers to the norms and values that exist within any group of people. So cultural variation is interested in the differences in the norms and values between groups of people. We're interested in how the attachment types differ between cultures. Will there be more secure attachments in the USA than in Japan? Which cultures might have higher insecure avoidant attachment types, and why might this be? As we explore cultural variation, it is helpful to bear in mind a distinction that is often made between certain cultures. Individualistic cultures, typically the West, such as the USA and the UK, prioritise the individual, independence and autonomy over the group, whereas more collectivist cultures such as China and Japan prioritise the group, family and community over the individual. So how do psychologists conduct research to learn about the variation of attachment across cultures? Well, this brings us to the research of Van Eysendorn and Cronenberg in 1988, who conducted a meta-analysis. And yes, I know it sounds like a character from The Lord of the Rings and a type of beer.
Welcome, my lords, to Isengard!
Rather than carry out a new study, a meta-analysis takes the data from many other studies that have previously been conducted and
Lots of math. Don't worry about it. I don't even understand. I can't do a meta-analysis, and I've been studying these for a while.
Combines the results to see the overall effect or trends. In this case, Van Eysendorn and Cronenberg analysed 32 studies from 8 countries, totalling nearly 2,000 participants. All of these 32 studies made use of the strange situation to measure attachment. They analysed all the data to see the pattern of attachment types across the different countries. They wanted to see if there were any intercultural differences, that is, differences between cultures, and they also wanted to see if there were any intracultural differences, that is, differences within cultures. Before I show you what they found, here's the list of countries that were included. Do you want to predict the results? Feel free to pause the video now and have a think for yourself. Here's what they found. In terms of the differences between cultures, as you can see from the table, secure attachment was the most common in all the cultures studied. Interestingly, Germany had a higher number of insecure avoidant attachments compared to other cultures, with Japan having the lowest number of insecure avoidant children. In fact, countries like Japan, China and Israel had relatively higher insecure resistant rates compared to the other countries. So, why might there be this cultural variation between Germany and Japan, for example? Well, Germany is an individualistic culture, and at the time of the research, highly valued independence in their children. As a result, behaviours that would be identified as insecure avoidant are viewed positively in German children. In fact, one study in Germany by Grossman et al. In 1985 commented that German parents seek independent, non-clingy infants who do not make demands on parents but obey their commands. In contrast, Japan is a collectivist culture, and at the time of the research highly valued dependence, with the norm being for babies to stay very close physically with the mother at all times. Now, when they looked at the differences within cultures, they found that it was 1.5 times greater than the variation between cultures. I'll say that again. When they looked at the differences within cultures, they found that it was 1.5 times greater than the variation between cultures. In other words, there were bigger differences within cultures than there were between them. For example, variation in the USA ranged from one study showing 46% secure attachment, whereas another study found 90% were securely attached. So what does all this mean? Well, firstly, it suggests that the pattern of attachment found in the USA with Ainsworth's original work also appears to be the pattern across other cultures too. Secure attachment appears to be the norm, and suggests that secure attachment might be the best attachment for healthy emotional and social development. This universal finding for secure attachment further points to the notion that attachment might be an innate biological process. Secondly, though, the research into cultural variation suggests that there are still differences in the patterns of attachment across cultures, as seen with Germany and Japan. And this reflects the differences in their cultural practices and values. Now let's critically consider and think through Van Eysendorn and Cronenberg's research. One of the strengths of the research into the cultural variations in attachment is its standardised methodology. Standardised simply means that things are kept the same. All of the 32 studies included in the meta-analysis made use of the same method to measure attachment, the strange situation. As we saw in the video on the strange situation, this is a highly controlled observation that uses the same 8 episodes, each lasting for 3 minutes, and also uses a clear set of behavioural categories. This standardised methodology means that the researchers can accurately compare attachment behaviours across different cultures without the problem of extraneous variables messing with the way attachment was studied. However,
So I want to talk about, he's talking about how reliable is this research? How well can we say these results here are accurate if we looked in another place in this country? If we were looking in another part of the US, we would probably find something similar when comparing across other countries, because of those standardized methods.
if I put the results up from the meta-analysis again, does anything stand out to you as a potential problem? Take a look at the number of studies conducted in each country.
Yep.
For some countries, that's a very low number of studies. Here's the problem. How representative are those samples of the cultures of those countries? For example, Japan is a very large country with many subcultures. A study by Eysendorn and Sagi in 2001 found differences in attachment types between the city of Tokyo and more rural parts of Japan. Tokyo demonstrated attachment type patterns similar to studies in Western countries, whereas studies in more rural parts of Japan reported much higher insecure resistant children. Therefore, this suggests you cannot make comparisons between countries like Japan and the USA if you do not know the specific culture of the sample being studied. The samples in the 2 studies from Japan, for example.
So what he's saying, and this is what I was speaking to, is you need to be careful. And I'm going to move on from this, because what I see here is kind of this lesson that this does suggest, and I do believe, based on both individualistic and collectivist cultures, secure attachment is highly valued. If you think about non-Western cultures, part of what he was referring to earlier in the video is that And something I mentioned earlier was kind of these Korean Americans who are always close to their babies. That type of behavior produces secure attachment. Now, in the US, we might not do the same exact behavior, but our goal is to develop secure attachment. And what he is saying is that it seems this might be true across the world, but we don't have enough information to know that for sure. And that means that it is still important. And even in this research, there are clear differences. I didn't know that about Germany, that Germany is highly individualistic. And how do you address parents where you see there's this insecure avoidant, which is similar to anxious disorganized? How do we work with these parents and families to help them both reach their personal goals, to also continue to support the growth and development of that child in a healthy way? Okay. Let me see.
Example, may not be very representative of Japan
cool.
as a whole. In fact, to their credit, Van Eysendorn and Cronenberg state that, quote, great caution should be exercised in assuming that an individual sample is representative of a particular culture.
And that's what I say in previous, but the idea is we see a lot of similarities in attachment styles, but there's still more to learn. Here's what I want you to do. So, and this can be based on more than just the video, just what we've talked about so far with regards to attachment. So both the attachment video about attachment theory and then the video about cultural variations. What new piece of knowledge did you gain from this video? What surprised you? Why is this important? And how will you use this information in your career? So what I would like you to do is open a Word document on your computer. And once the timer begins, just start typing. When the timer ends, you're done. And then there will be a Blackboard location where you can submit your 2-minute essay. Okay? Again, not punitive. This is just to get you writing and thinking about this idea of attachment and how do we use this information across cultures? How does this fit into our cultural competence? But also just what surprised you? What was new to you? This is more a writing exercise to get your thoughts flowing. Okay? means it's done. All right, so when you're done that, just submit it right to Blackboard, okay? No reason to wait. All right, and this should be our last piece, I think. So introduction to early intervention. I'm gonna go through this a little quick. And I'm sorry, this is a lot of information in one slide that I did not use animations for. My apologies. So I'm going to go through this quickly because I think it's important to know about. It is something relevant to young children and relevant to human services if you're interested in being in a helping field and working with our youngest population. Early intervention is a federally funded and state funded but state implemented program, which means it is different how states implement it. New Hampshire early intervention is different from Rhode Island's early intervention and is different from North Carolina, 3 states I've done early intervention in. It is the program for children birth to their 3rd birthday who have developmental delays, so they could have a significant language delay if they're not talking at all by 2 or communicating. When we're talking about infants, by a year, infants should be tracking and scanning. If they're not doing that, that can sometimes be indicative of a developmental disability like autism. Documented disabilities also qualify. Down syndrome, that's something we know a child will have when they're born because it's a chromosomal abnormality. Angelman syndrome, and then at-risk factors. These are factors that we know can lead children to a delay or disability, but they're more environmental. So your socioeconomic status, if you're homeless, that's an environmental factor. If you have a parent with low education level, those are factors that when aggregated together can lead to qualification and early intervention or eligibility. And the idea is we know, I fixed this on my other one, sorry. We know that early intervention at that time, the brain is most elastic. So what we do then is most impactful. And what we don't do then becomes more permanent and more difficult to address. And we're trying to bridge this gap between what seem to be delays to meeting or getting close to those developmental milestones that we expect, with cultural variation, of course. What do? So a child is referred to early intervention typically by a doctor, usually it's a pediatrician, because pediatricians should be screening around 6 months. And then an evaluation team, which the service coordinator might not be there, but there should be 2 interdisciplinary, so a speech therapist and an occupational therapist, people with 2 very distinctly different career paths, is how I like to say it. A physical therapist is much different than an educator. They could evaluate together. They conduct an evaluation, determine a child's eligibility. So if they show developmental delays in 1 or 2 categories, they could be eligible. And then once they're eligible, the team, including a service coordinator, creates an individualized family services plan. And that is like, if you've heard of an individualized education program, it's very similar. But the difference is this is created in the family's home, typically alongside that parent, to ensure parent input is reflected. This plan of service is created for 6 months, and at that point, a reevaluation is conducted. What is unique about early intervention compared to school-based services is it is family-centered. And this specifically means that early intervention providers are coaching parents. Instead of working directly with the child, they're providing the skills and strategies to parents so that they can facilitate healthy development in the absence of a provider, because the provider can only be there 1 day a week, usually for an hour. That's not much time. So we rely on providing services to the entire family so that family functioning supports the development of the child and supports bridging those gaps between what is a delay and then what we know is typical development for an age. And the other piece is that it is always occurring in the natural environment, which is typically 90% of the time the parent's home. But there are lots of families that have to send their child to daycare, and thus, if the child is in a daycare for a significant period of time per week, then the early intervention providers will go to the daycare to provide service. And rather than working with the parent, they work with a daycare provider because then they're the ones providing primary care during that time. Something to know about, it's a very important service. And if you are in human services, you are going to work with a lot of different families. I've worked with a lot of different families from different backgrounds. And simply we have to share this information because they don't all know that this exists. And it's a highly beneficial program. So I had to discuss that. I'll share more as the semester progresses, but I wanted to introduce it. Again, I referred to a little bit of this. Why does it matter? Because if you are supporting a family and or a child in a school, or if you are a mental health provider, if you are a pediatrician, if you know you're going to be a medical provider, you should know that we are screening children by 6 months. And if those screenings suggest the child is delayed or could be delayed, or at risk for a delay, we refer to an EI program. These interventions are most effective in the first 2 years of life. And that is because our brains are developing rapidly and they're elastic, which means it's easier to make changes. So it's easier to bridge those gaps. And if we don't, they widen. And we put children at further risk for learning disabilities, etc. So we'll talk more about infant toddler development and whatnot, although I'm going to try not to cover too much because this is a cultural competence course and I want to make sure we keep it to that subject matter. What I want to caution here is that screenings are based on normative charts. So doctors need to keep into account cultural variations in development and child rearing. However, as someone who's worked in autism, I know that there have been a lot of instances where Black and brown families have been told to wait and see if they have concerns about their child potentially having autism. And more often than not, we then see that Black and brown families were being diagnosed significantly later than white middle class. And so remember, these normative charts are based on white middle class children. We still need to take time to understand the individual family. And before we make a decision as to is a referral necessary, which sometimes it is, just to be careful, we need to understand that family dynamic. A lot of families from, I've met a lot of different parents from countries outside the US that said their children didn't speak till much later, but they had typical development. But we want to be careful because a wait and see approach sometimes puts the children at risk for further delays. All right, part 2 is done. That's enough. Let's wrap up. Oh, we talked about so much. So we reviewed some key points on genetics and prenatal development, although less on that. We discussed newborn parenting differences, let's say. Specifically, we talked about breastfeeding is one, and response to crying. We talked about attachment. Oh, did we ever? Attachment theory and cultural and related cultural variations. And then we were introduced, introduction to early intervention. Why does this matter? Why does it matter? And what do they do? All right. All right. So please complete your exit ticket when you have watched this, and then you will be done with this part for the week. Thank you so much.